Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We are right smack in the middle of what we've been terming English reciprocity toward the natives of Connecticut in the weeks leading up to the Pequot War. Last week, we worked our way through the actions of John Endecott and his men on Block Island. That part of the expedition had not gone as planned. Although there were no English casualties, there were also very few Niantic casualties. You remember, the goal had been to kill all the men and take the women and children to sell as slaves. Anything less would be failure. Not to mention, this was a volunteer army. The pay was supposed to be in booty. When the Block Island expedition ended, those objectives were not met. The volunteers would profit almost nothing. Eventually, Massachusetts Bay would benefit as these same natives, once marked for destruction, would become one of the native groups who would pay annual tribute to the English in the form of wampum. Long term, that would seem to have been a bigger benefit to the English colony. More than the short-term benefit of these men in our current narrative, had they succeeded. As they made their way to Pequot Country, they stopped at Fort Saybrook, where there was more than a little disgust on the part of Lion Gardiner. His concern was the safety and viability of Saybrook. He answered to powerful men in England who had made considerable investment in the fort and settlement. The Massachusetts Bay expedition threatened that safety and viability. Ultimately, John Endecott and Lion Gardiner came to an agreement that Saybrook would also take part in the journey, if for no other reason than to gather Pequot corn to replace the corn of Saybrook that was most assuredly going to be stolen or destroyed by the Pequots when they exacted their revenge. It's an odd thing. Massachusetts Bay would provoke a bad situation that Lion Gardiner of Saybrook was against. Yet it was understood that Saybrook would face retaliation. That's not a fun place to be. And as we ended last week, the English were just entering the Pequot village. And as we've previously seen in other events, the Pequots were not aware that there was still an issue between them and the English. By Algonquin standards, their issues should have been resolved. Both sides simply refused to recognize the cultural norms and expectation of the other. It's not even about if they agreed or could ever have come to an agreement on what to do. The thing that gets me here is that neither side seems to have shown curiosity or concern about what the other group's expectations would or should be. I mean, it's a clash of cultures, to be sure. John Underhill made some observations along the way that portray the Pequots as ignorant of the depth of English contempt or covetousness toward them. We closed last week in part with this. Quote, as they approached the Pequot village, they, the Pequots, were still ignorant of the English intentions. Although later accounts, official accounts, would record the Pequots started the trouble, that appears to be refutable by John Underhill's initial remarks at the time. And we continued, he recorded that as they approached the village, quote, from John Underhill, the Indians, spying, came running in multitudes along the waterside, crying, what cheer, Englishmen, what cheer? What do you come for? Anticipating that they were there to trade. Boy, did that mood change quickly. What happened next must have made everyone's stomach turn. It must have made everyone's blood run cold, as the excitement was changed to confusion and dread very quickly, end quote. So it looks like the initial reaction, as recorded by John Underhill, was one of peace, friendship, and the desire for mutual trade and commerce. And I tend to trust Underhill's accounts for a variety of reasons. Over the magistrates of Boston. They were politicians and diplomats, ambassadors with business interests and an objective. They had many audiences to please, and their records sometimes reflect a situational bias that pleases the intended audience, like almost all people everywhere. John Underhill was not that kind of public servant. He fully believed in these missions in the name of God and country. He did not feel the need to hide or to alter what he recorded, what he did, what he saw. And as we saw a few weeks ago, he stayed true to the mission. He recorded what he saw and made no apologies. He was an agent of the colony, whatever colony that was that he happened to be working for at the time, English or Dutch, and a pragmatist. If you made friends, great. If you killed people en masse, so be it. So from a Pequot mindset, it does not seem like much had changed from a few weeks prior when they had tried to trade directly with Saybrook. But soon, on this day, the Pequot excitement was soured as the reality set in that this was not a trading party. They then began to shout, quote, "What, Englishmen? What cheer? Are you hoggery? And will you cram us? That is, are you angry? Will you kill us? Do you come to fight?" End quote. The English did not reply. So as they approached, the Pequots do not appear to be a people driven by rage or revenge or even a desire to fight. By now they were fully aware of the danger, but still would not provoke violence. I would have. At least at this point, this small contingency at least would have been destroyed if the Pequots wanted to. Nothing happened that day. But that night, the Pequots, now fully aware of what was going on, made fires on both sides of the river to discourage the English from invading while it was still dark. It was a tense situation for the English. Of this particular night, Underhill wrote, quote, "The natives called to one another to gather their forces together, fearing the English were come to war against them." End quote. They were so loud across the water that Underhill also wrote that the English could scarce rest. That must have been eerie. For both sides. Think about the Pequots as they work through what to do with their wives and their little ones right there, watching and hearing what's going on, seeing the men preparing. And think about the men, fathers, husbands, sons, brothers, all trying to figure the best move, knowing that you could take this group and knowing also there would be more to come if you did. What would you do if this was your neighborhood? Practically everyone you knew and held dear all gathered together waiting for an uninvited guest or unexpected hostile visitor to make a move. And then think about the fear and the intimidation that these English felt at this time, right now, that night, hearing these loud screams across the water. Never mind the aggression level that they brought with them. This would be very nerve-wracking. I wonder how many of those guys sitting in the dark that night, remembering the failed mission among the Eastern Niantics just days earlier, were having some severe second thoughts. There was not just restraint on the part of the Pequots. They didn't just rush out and kill the English. But there's also a display of courage here, real courage. At daybreak, a wise old sage actually boarded an English vessel and asked for an explanation. That's pretty bold. He received an ominous and not so friendly reply. Quote, "The governors of the bay sent us to demand the heads of those persons that had slain Captains Norton and Stone and the rest of their company." End quote. The Pequots had been alerted once again. The English were not going to let this go. Basically, the explanation was, this is me saying this, right? But basically what they were saying was, give us the heads of the killers or we're going to war. All this for a guy that the English, the Puritans, did not even feel the slightest responsibility for just a few weeks prior. If you remember, they had originally said that any retribution for the killing of Stone would have come through Virginia. It was at this point that the Pequots gave a fuller account of the killing of Captain Stone. Now, we already dealt with the newer, more quote-unquote official version in a past episode. But in short, the killing of Stone had been a retribution killing for Tadobem, the main Pequot sachem. The Dutch had killed him, and Stone's murder was, in the Pequot version, a case of mistaken identity. They thought Captain Stone was Dutch. Again, the difference in cultural reciprocity. The Pequots felt the murder was just and equitable. The English did not. Also, the killing of Tadobem was a Dutch response to the Pequots killing foreign natives who had come into Pequot territory to trade with the Dutch. That was a deal that the Dutch had insisted upon for the Pequots, but it was also a deal that could put the Pequot nation in jeopardy. In any of these events, based on the times in which these folks lived and where they lived, the Pequots seem to have been given a raw deal. It's been a couple of weeks since we talked about the murder of Captain Stone, and so I want to read a couple of passages talking about this same interaction right here on the Pequot River. The first quote is going to be from Alfred A. Cave, a book called The Pequot War. And the second quote will be from Leo Bonfanti from a book called The Pequot Mohegan War. And I've used both of these narratives quite a bit to help develop the story fuller. So just as a reminder, again, of the murder of Captain Stone, we've had a couple of different, quote unquote, official records of this. But this is what the old Pequot diplomat shared with them this day, getting later in the year in 1636 on the shores of the Pequot River. Alfred Cave explained it this way, quote, "By braining Stone, Sassacus had intended to avenge the death of his own father who, not long before, he had been kidnapped by the Dutch, who had then betrayed all decent custom by putting the former Grand Sachem to death after his kinsman had paid the substantial ransom demanded for his life. With great emotion, the Pequot envoy demanded that the English consider the implications of that outrage. Who, he cried, could blame us for avenging so cruel a murder? As the English started to protest, he added that the Pequots could not possibly have known that Stone and his compatriots were not accessories to the murder of Tatelbem. For we distinguished not between the Dutch and the English, but took them to be one nation, and therefore we do not conceive that we wronged you, for they slew our king, and thinking these captains to be of the same nation and people of those that slew him, made us set upon this course of revenge." End quote. And then again, one more quote from Leo Bonfanti on this, and he appears to be quoting the old Pequot diplomat as he's talking about what happened in the aftermath of Tatelbem's murder. So he says this, quote, "Shortly after this, other white men came to our shore, pretending to trade as the others had done. We did not undeceive them, but went quietly on board their vessel. The son of our murdered Sachem stayed in the cabin with Captain Stone until the captain fell asleep from drinking too much strong water. Our Sachem then took a little hatchet from under his robe and knocked him on the head. Our people attacked the other white men, but when one of them took up a firebrand and set fire to the powder, they leaped into the river. In this manner, they saved themselves while the strangers were all blown up and destroyed. You cannot blame us for revenging our Sachem's murder, for we distinguish not between the Dutch and the English, supposing them to be all one people. We do not conceive that we have done you any wrong, having only endeavored to revenge our Sachem's death." End quote. I mean, he's kind of got a point here, doesn't he? I mean, a lot of things get overlooked in the name of diplomacy. And sadly, a lot of things are ignited and blown up, inflated in that same name of diplomacy. And so it is. Lastly, Bonfanti said this, quote, "The Sachem, this Pequot mentioned, was undoubtedly Wapigwuit, which is another name for Tatelbem, who was probably killed by the Dutch in this manner. Endecott, who knew nothing of Indian traditions and customs, would not agree that the Indians were justified in seeking revenge. And he told the Pequot, quote, you know well enough the difference between the English and the Dutch, for you have had many dealings with both. Since you have slain subjects of the English king, we demand an account of their blood." End quote. Again, there doesn't seem to be any wiggle room or any rationale or any consideration on the part of the English that anything that the Pequots had done was innocent in any way. I mean, the admission from the old diplomat here was probably meant to get the English to lighten their demand. I mean, what they described was a vengeance killing for their dead chief. Their current chief had done it. I mean, surely they weren't going to give him up, right? So you give us the killers of Captain Stone and his crew, or we go to war. And so this old diplomat lays the storyline out again, the narrative. Only what he says is our new main Sachem was avenging the old main Sachem's murder. You can't possibly think that we're going to give you our chief, right? I mean, so courage and diplomacy are hard when you have zero leverage. That's what the Pequots were working with right now, zero leverage. even if you have logic and reason behind it. The English, in my opinion, were just unreasonable here. But the old sage was allowed to leave the boat and confer with his people. Endecott, however, was leery. He supposed that a trap was in the making, so he immediately ordered his men to disembark. They were armed and ready for battle. If there was a Pequot strategy being played out, it was not what the English suspected. With this action, the old diplomat returned, and Bonfanti said this, quote, "When he returned, he suggested that they stay where they were while the several hundred Pequots who had assembled remained on the other side of the hill. This would keep them separated by a great enough distance to preclude the possibility of an incident that might precipitate open warfare between the two people. Since the suggestion came from the Indian, Endecott was sure that the natives wanted him to remain where he was for other reasons. Afraid that his position was vulnerable, he marched the men to the top of the hill, which he felt could be more easily defended. When the soldiers were assembled on the hill, they were quickly surrounded by 300 or more warriors, most of whom were unarmed. Among them were a large number who were well acquainted with the Saybrook soldiers, and they began to talk with them in a curious mixture of broken English and Pequot." End quote. So again, just by their actions, Endecott and the English don't present themselves very well, at least to me. They're very provocative. I mean, they look pretty paranoid here. There's nothing in the Pequot outward actions or activity that would have indicated that they were strategizing some sneak attack. I mean, the English had come unannounced. They were the provocateurs and the aggressors here. It's kind of funny, like they're the ones scheming against the Pequots, but they're the ones paranoid thinking the Pequots are scheming against them. So anyways, when the envoy returned, he informed Endecott that the two main sachems were on a trip to Long Island, and so the group could not give them an answer right now. And again, the English did not trust the information that they received. They thought it was another trick. They believed Sassacus to be home in a nearby village. And they threatened to, quote, "beat the drum and march through the counter and spoil your corn," end quote, if Sassacus did not come to see them. Again, the envoy left telling them that he'd try again. I mean, picture this scene. This was not a comfortable situation. It must have been frustrating for everybody. But I think about just the regular English soldiers standing there, the guys that had come to fight, right? It was summertime. The sun was blazing hot. The men were arrayed in battle armor and attire and fully clothed. I mean, they're just waiting there in the sun for hours. John Underhill sang their praises. Of this time, he said, quote, "They used as much patience as ever men might, considering the gross abuse they offered us, holding us above an hour in vain hopes," end quote. I do find that kind of humorous. Yeah, right. You know, the abuses the Pequots offered the English, who happened to show up armed, threatening war, and making bombastic, untenable demands. I mean, who's abusing who here? I think this is almost a laughable situation. Finally, the English were informed that another sachem, lesser, but able to make decisions, was located and would be with them shortly. And his name was Menetech. So after another hour, word came to hold tight just a little longer. The killers of Stone were being rounded up, and the fugitive from Block Island, wanted for the killing of John Oldham, well, his fate was being discussed as they waited. With all of these delays, the Pequots had been busy. The English began to realize that there were no women or children in sight. They noticed men burying corn and household items, and they took this as a sign of war. The decision was made to strike first. I wonder if it was war or defense. I mean, protecting their most vulnerable. And in the case of the children, targets of the English, you remember they wanted hostages. Maybe this was an act of preserving their food and everyday household items. I mean, that seems just as plausible and more in line with their previous attitudes and behaviors. So at this critical moment, another Pequot ambassador visited the English, and he suggested that they lay down their weapons and march 30 paces forward toward the Pequots, where a sachem would come and talk to them. And again, this seems like it could be a setup or it could be a legitimate security operation on the part of the Pequots. But as usual, English paranoia kicked in, and they took this as a setup for disaster. I would say the Pequots did yell out to the English in a fashion that was taken as mockery for standing in the hot sun for so long. I probably would have been laughing at them too. I might not have yelled in mockery, but I probably would have been laughing at them as well. It must have looked pretty foolish. At any rate, by this time, night was coming. Endecott was not willing to wait anymore. Maybe he did feel foolish. Maybe the taunting got to him. Maybe it got to his men. Maybe he just felt like he was getting the runaround. Maybe he was paranoid. But at any rate, as soon as the messengers, who had been guaranteed safe passage as they were under a flag of truce, as soon as the messengers were safely out of firing range, the English fired on the Pequots and advanced. The Pequots would not engage them. A small contingency did fire a volley of arrows as they retreated into the woods. The English were ill-prepared to follow them into the woods, and so, like Block Island before, all the English could do was burn the wigwams and the food. And they dug up the buried goods and burned those as well. Now, once they were finished there, they decided to take some of their frustrations out on the Western Nyantics, who were allies and tributaries of the Pequots. But like the Pequots, they failed to engage them in battle. So, in the now established manner of English failure to engage an actual enemy, they destroyed all that they could of these people as well. Then they returned to Saybrook for a short layover before returning to Boston. Now remember, these guys were not being paid. The booty that was supposed to have materialized was to have been their pay. In all of this, only a single Englishman was recorded as wounded. The Pequot losses are up for debate. Captain Underhill claimed that only certain numbers had been slain and wounded. John Winthrop, who was not there, would later record 13 dead Pequots. His source was the Narragansetts. So what was supposed to be a lucrative endeavor for Massachusetts Bay turned out to be expensive, not profitable. They actually ended up paying the volunteers. I mean, nobody could have been too happy with that. I'll bet the pay was not worth their effort. I mean, you've got old, disconnected bureaucrats setting the value on young men's efforts after the fact. Yeah, I'm not thinking this was very equitable. Meanwhile, back in Saybrook, Lion Gardiner was not happy. He was less than impressed. He claimed the only Pequot casualty was because of one of the guides, Cutshamakin, who had scalped his victim before he could be restrained. I mean, this report was from the Saybrook men who had been a part of the mission. I think probably more trustworthy than most. But there was more to Lion Gardiner's grievances than just a failed mission. And make no mistake, that's what this was, a failure all the way around, when you think about it. I mean, what was the objective? Rather, what were the objectives, plural? Kill Nyantics, sell Nyantics into slavery, extract payment and people from the Pequots, as well as children. None of that happened. I mean, brag all you want, take courage and pride in destroying undefended crops and houses, but the mission's objectives were not met. And yet, these men returned to Boston to a hero's welcome. I mean, what a load of bullshit. Don't we see this same kind of posturing today all the time? It's pathetic. But again, there was more to report on the behavior and or ability of John Endecott to carry out his orders. I mean, he wasn't even faithful to Lion Gardiner or Saybrook in his actions, fellow Englishmen. I mean, frankly, all the way around, this is not a good look for the venerable John Endecott. I mean, he hadn't been very admirable towards Saybrook's men or needs either. He did not show a lot of regard for anybody, frankly. I mean, remember, there were a lot of English in Connecticut at this time, and he had instigated the natives across the region, and then he got to leave. So first and foremost, they had not helped to gather corn for Saybrook. I mean, actually, they had not even provided an environment where this would have been reasonably possible. Remember, that's why Lion Gardiner agreed to send men as part of the mission, was so that he could actually collect corn, knowing that his crops were eventually probably going to be destroyed. Remember, John Endecott had done his best to burn all of the corn up, frankly, in front of the Saybrook guys. I wonder what they were thinking at those points in this mission. I mean, were they so caught up in the moment that they took part in the burning of the crops? Did they try to stop it? I mean, were they at all concerned for how these actions were going to be addressed at their own houses? It does seem like an easy thing to go to a far place, provoke the enemy natives, and then leave. But there are always people left behind, vulnerable people, usually who had entered the situation, even if reluctantly, like the men from Saybrook, under at least a modicum of belief that their needs and their security would be taken care of, if only to find out too late that that may not be the case. Then the aggressors and the provocateurs simply go home and they leave them to fend for themselves. And again, like so many of the things that we see going on in this narrative, this is not something new. This isn't unique to these guys. A dominant society or culture will build up a military presence in a less dominant culture. They'll disrupt the local politics and the local social structure. And then when they're done with their business, they simply leave. And the people that are left behind are stuck dealing with all of the difficulty that they've created, all of the chaos that they've created. Not only did John Endecott and the boys from Massachusetts Bay not help, they actually hindered the gathering of corn. They also violated trust when they failed to allow the Saybrook pinnaces to leave first, thus denying them safe travels back to the fort with that needed corn. The folks from Saybrook were still loading the corn into the boats when John Endecott ordered the withdrawal of the 3 pinnaces under his command. Nice guy. So the small Saybrook contingent had been left amongst the angry Pequots. And as they tried to make their own dramatic getaway, the winds changed direction and they could not get down the river. And here they did something that's either very stupid or very brave. I'm not sure which. I mean, I'm not even sure that those two terms are altogether mutually exclusive. Maybe the combination of these two words, stupid and brave, is some derivative of pragmatism. Because anyway, their long-term situation had not escaped them. If they survived this particular situation, they would still be in need of corn. So they left the stranded pinnace and started to gather more corn. And predictably, now that they had had time to process and the English contingent had shrunk, the Pequots attacked them as they traveled back to the boat. And again, I can't stop asking myself or thinking about this in my own head, like how much corn did this activity actually yield? So at any rate, a small battle ensued. A large group of Pequots had been hiding in the woods nearby and attacked 10 at a time with a barrage of arrows. And this seems odd to me. Why not attack all at once? Make sure you kill them all. I mean, at this point, everybody was on the same page as to what the relationship between the Pequots and the English looked like, what it was going to be. But the Englishmen, they fell into line and they organized their musket fire. And although the Pequots had attacked from behind, there was no frontal assault. So the path to the river was open. Now, don't misunderstand the narrative. This was not a quick assault. It was not some ambush out of nowhere that elicited a quick response that quickly dissipated. The assault lasted for hours. I mean, there's enough Pequots, in rotation. These guys, they just can't stop, keeping the rear guard and firing at them. So I wonder, just how many men were there at this point? What were they carrying for supplies? How efficient was this harvest or this theft of Pequot corn? Was the Dutch guy still there? Remember that trader that they hired? Did he have a crew that was helping? I mean, what made him stay? He owed these guys nothing. He could have left and never returned, right? Never gone back to trade with the English. They would never have seen him again. And finally, however, with their arrows gone, the Pequots retreated and the English made a dash for their boats. The wind by this time had changed and they were able to sail away. But imagine the conversation they had as they sailed. Was it nervous laughter at their escape? When I was younger, we used to do crazy things sometimes. And you've got this heightened sense of fear and there's adrenaline and you're excited when you're doing the activity. But then when it's over, you sit around and sometimes you laugh at just how stupid or how dangerous it was. You wonder if these guys kind of felt that way, just overcome with the emotion of it all. Maybe they were angry at the Massachusetts Bay guys. Maybe there was anger at Lion Gardiner for having sent them. You wonder, did they just cry, for joy or for fear? I mean, What was that celebration like as they sailed away? And how about the Pequots? I mean, you can just imagine them standing around. What the hell just happened? And I imagine a lot of head shaking and a lot of tough talk, a lot of soul searching and confusion on how to proceed. I mean, these guys had families, they had needs, they had responsibilities. They had not picked this fight, but it was clear how things were going to go after this. In the aftermath, John Winthrop, back in Boston, did not care how the expedition went. He completely dismissed Gardiner's complaints of abandonment. And again, from the safety of Boston, as one excuse to Gardiner why this had not been a big deal, the abandonment, Winthrop noted that the Pequots had shot their arrows at too steep an angle to do any real harm. I mean, after all, only one guy had been injured, and that was in the leg. And besides, during this skirmish, the English had actually managed to kill some Pequots. I mean, this just sounds like an out-of-touch old man. It's kind of the same old, right? Old men's prerogatives through young men's blood, sweat, and tears, with no real reward in the end. No accountability, with the smallest of victories exaggerated and celebrated, and the colossal losses justified, rationalized, and ultimately dismissed. I mean, does that sound about right? Gardiner laid much of the blame on Massachusetts Bay. He did not think much of their men. I mean, remember, Lion Gardiner is a trained, seasoned military guy. He wasn't some foolish old politician with, little to lose and much to gain. Of this last account, he said, quote, "My men were pursued by Indians, and 2 of them came home wounded," end quote. Again, you see the contradiction between those who were there and Winthrop, who was not. Winthrop said 1 guy was injured, Gardiner's claiming 2. Frankly, the only guy to know this would be Gardiner at this point. I mean, Endecott had left as well. I mean, it's fine that John Winthrop had the opportunity to frame so much of the official narrative, but it's unfortunate that even his own men were not present for very much of it. I mean, does that mean nobody's ever credible if they're not there? Of course not. But throughout the various events leading us up to this point, there were objectives that had been established. And many of those objectives, then, seem to have gone looking for a rationale. I mean, I'm just saying. And the counter-information appears credible and consistent. The actions of Endecott were duly noted by others as well. In the aftermath, Alfred Cave explains it this way, and in part includes an exchange between Governor Winslow from Plymouth and John Winthrop from Massachusetts Bay. He says this, quote, "The Saybrook commander was not alone in his exasperation. The governor of the Plymouth colony soon thereafter wrote to Winthrop to complain, as Winthrop recorded, quote, that we had occasioned a war, etc., by provoking the Pequots," end quote. Stung by that accusation, Winthrop replied that Plymouth should blame the Pequots, not the Bay Colony. God had clearly deprived the Pequots of common reason. Otherwise, they would have complied long before with the request that they surrender the murderers of Captain Stone and his men. Endecott's recent action, Winthrop proclaimed, was entirely justified, as we want not to make war upon them, but to do justice. Endecott's army had killed 13 Pequots and burned 60 wigwams, a fair and reasonable retribution for their killing of 4 or 5 Englishmen. Winthrop apologized only for the failure to kill more Pequots, explaining that, quote, "they fled from us, and we could not follow them in our own armor, neither had any to guide us in their country," end quote. He concluded his explanation of the rationale for the Endecott raid by expressing the hope that the Pequots had finally learned their lesson as, quote, "they saw that they could not save themselves, nor their corn and houses, from so few of ours," end quote. Plymouth's traders on the Connecticut River and other settlers vulnerable to Pequot reprisals did not share Winthrop's sanguine view of the matter. The river towns of Connecticut were no less exasperated than Saybrook or Plymouth at Boston's heavy-handed provocation of an Indian war. In April, they wrote to the Bay Colony to protest that their lives had been placed in jeopardy by Endecott's raid. End quote. So we set the stage. We've seen the buildup and now the opening salvos in the Pequot War. The Pequots had, in my opinion, showed restraint. They had not demonstrated the cold-heartedness and bloodthirsty behavior as their reputation had suggested. But this incident, or the series of incidents that culminated in the failed yet destructive mission of John Endecott, would be the provocation that broke the proverbial camel's back. They would retaliate, and the English settlements of Connecticut would all be in jeopardy. But that's a story for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.